Okay, bonjour. Good afternoon. Very nice to see everyone here. Today I hosted a provincial and territorial finance ministers meeting. This was a return to in-person meetings, and it was really, really nice, really helpful to get together, to see each other face to face. We had supper together last night, and then a very good, rich, wide-ranging conversation today, working together on key priorities for Canadians. We are a group of ministers from every major political party in Canada, and of course, we do not always agree on everything. But we all know that we are most successful when we can work together to serve Canadians. We saw that when we came together to support Canadians during the pandemic. David Naylor, a former president of this university, noted in a study published by the Canadian Medical Association Journal last summer that if Canada had had the COVID mortality rate of the United States, nearly 70,000 additional Canadians would have died. That's such a big number. It is the population of some provincial capitals. And one of the things we did reflect on together is how Canadians, working together from coast to coast to coast, helped prevent that from happening. And by focusing relentlessly on jobs, together, we were able to keep millions of Canadians employed, to keep millions of Canadian households solvent, and to keep Canadian businesses, Canadian small businesses, afloat. We avoided serious economic scarring during the COVID recession. And that is one of the reasons why Canada has experienced such a remarkable economic recovery from the pandemic recession. Selon les prévisions du FMI, le Canada connaîtra la deuxième plus rapide croissance économique parmi les pays du G7 cette année autant que l'année prochaine. En septembre, 69 000 emplois ont été ajoutés à l'économie et notre taux de chômage de 5% enregistré est près de son creux historique. Quelques 659 000 Canadiens de plus ont un emploi aujourd'hui qu'avant la pandémie. Et nous avons récupéré 121% des emplois perdus pendant la pandémie, par rapport à seulement 6% aux États-Unis. Notre taux d'activité a atteint 65% en décembre, y compris un record de 80% pour les personnes âgées de 15 à 64 ans, par rapport à seulement 74% aux États-Unis. De plus, en partie grâce aux ententes sur les services abordables d'apprentissage et de garde des jeunes enfants, qui l'ensemble des provinces et des territoires ont signé avec notre gouvernement. Le taux d'activité chez les femmes qui sont au cœur de leur vie active a atteint 85%. En comparaison, il était seulement 76% aux États-Unis. Nous avons ensemble discuté cela et nous tous, incluant le gouverneur du Banque du Canada, nous avons constaté que cela vraiment a ajouté à la force, la capacité de l'économie canadienne. Nous devons être tous fiers de notre travail ensemble. Ainsi, alors que je dis que nous sommes au mieux de notre forme lorsque nous travaillons ensemble, il ne s'agit pas d'une affirmation pleine d'espoir. C'est la réalité. Another issue we spoke about today was how we can work together to ensure better healthcare outcomes for Canadians across the country. We also heard from the Governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, and discussed the economic outlook for Canada and the world. As finance ministers, all of us around the table were very aware of the uncertainty in the global economy right now. Inflation is high, and interest rates are high. Things are tough for a lot of Canadians and a lot of Canadian families today. And at the federal level, this is a time of real fiscal constraint. We know that one of the most important things the federal government can do to help Canadians today is to be mindful of our responsibility not to pour fuel on the fire of inflation, not to force the Bank of Canada to raise rates even higher. So it was important for us to speak about why any new spending has to be targeted and focused on building an economy that is more sustainable and more prosperous, one that will create good-paying, stable jobs for Canadians for generations to come. The global net zero transition is the most significant economic transformation since the Industrial Revolution. And today, our democratic partners around the world are seeking to shift their economic dependency away from dictatorships and towards democracies like our own, what Secretary Yellen has called friendshoring. We need the provinces and territories to chip in and work with the federal government in our response to the Inflation Reduction Act. We need to work together to build Canada's 21st century economy. This is a huge economic opportunity, and it is the challenge of today. We need to rise to this moment for Canada and for Canadians. We have the chance to create prosperity, good jobs, and more vibrant communities for generations to come. This is a truly historic, once-in-a-generation economic moment, and it will take a Team Canada effort to seize it. So I was very glad to spend time today with my fellow finance ministers. I know that we can accomplish so much when we all work together, and today was an important opportunity to talk about that. Thank you very much, et je serai heureuse de répondre à vos questions.
We'll do one question, one follow-up, and if you could just give your name and outlet before you give your question. Ça va?
Merci. Oui.
OK. Allez-y, Christian. Merci.
Bonjour, Mme Freeland. Christian Noël de Radio-Canada.
Bonjour, Christian.
Vous dites pour lutter contre l'inflation et, j'imagine, faire concurrence aux États-Unis, les provinces vont devoir faire leur part. Deux questions. Un, vous, qu'est-ce que vous voulez que les provinces fassent pour faire leur part? Et deux, qu'est-ce que vous allez faire dans le budget? Est-ce qu'il y aura des incitatifs pour les entreprises comme aux États-Unis?
Alors, je ne vais pas aujourd'hui parler des précis détails du budget fédéral, évidemment. Mais comme on a dit dans l'énoncé économique de l'automne, on comprend l'importance de ce moment pour la création de toute l'économie industrielle du 21e siècle. On comprend aussi que le Canada est dans une excellente position. Nous avons vraiment des grandes opportunités. Mais comme vous avez dit, le plan économique des États-Unis, Inflation Reduction Act, a aussi créé une situation très compétitive au niveau mondial. Le Canada doit être là. Nous ne pouvons pas et nous n'allons pas perdre cette opportunité. Le fédéral a déjà fait beaucoup dans l'énoncé économique de l'automne. En ce qui concerne la création des subventions au niveau de la système des impôts. On comprend qu'on a encore du travail à faire au niveau de ce système de subvention du système des impôts. Mais il y a aussi des projets très spécifiques, des usines qui seront ou non construites dans des provinces spécifiques. Ça coûtera cher d'attirer les investissements pour ces usines. Et je pense que c'est seulement juste que les provinces travaillent avec le fédéral en partenariat pour attirer ces investissements. Aujourd'hui, j'étais aux tables avec toutes les provinces et territoires du Canada. Et évidemment, ce n'est pas chaque province ou chaque territoire qui peut attirer un grand investissement industriel. Alors, comme c'était la pratique toujours au Canada, quand on parle des grands projets qui seront très nécessaires, très importants pour tout le pays, et je suis absolument convaincue qu'ils sont nécessaires, que c'est une bonne opportunité. On pense aussi que c'est important, c'est juste, c'est équitable pour la province dans laquelle cet investissement sera fait, que cette province travaille en collaboration avec nous pour attirer l'investissement.
Au sujet des transferts, oui, voilà. Au sujet des transferts canadiens en santé, notamment. Ce matin, avant de commencer la rencontre, vous avez parlé beaucoup en anglais, fiscal restraint, restrictions budgétaires. Pourquoi est-ce que vous essayez de diminuer les attentes des provinces sur l'ampleur du montant des transferts en santé?
J'essaie d'être claire et ouverte avec les Canadiens et Canadiennes, avec les ministres des Finances, de la situation de le fédéral. Nous comprenons qu'aujourd'hui, il y a des grands investissements que nous devons faire. Nous devons faire des investissements dans les soins de santé. C'est évident, on a pris les engagements dans la campagne électorale et les Canadiens comprennent que c'est important de le faire et on sera là, comme l'a dit plusieurs fois le Premier ministre. En même temps, nous savons que des grands investissements dans l'économie industrielle du 21e siècle, de l'économie verte, ces investissements aussi sont nécessaires et 2023 sera l'année quand les grandes décisions seront prises. Alors, par des compagnies internationales, les décisions concernant le capital international seront prises cette année. Alors, je pense que c'est évident, je pense que chacun sera d'accord avec moi que le Canada doit être là. Ce sont deux grandes pressions sur le budget fédéral. Et c'est important pour moi, comme j'étais au retrait du cabinet, comme j'étais avec les membres du caucus, c'est important pour moi d'être claire, d'être franche, d'être ouverte, qu'on a ces deux grandes pressions, deux enjeux dans lesquels on doit investir et on va investir, mais en même temps, aujourd'hui, l'économie mondiale se ralentit. La situation fiscale au niveau fédéral est plus restreinte à cause de cela. Et pour cette raison, je pense que c'est important aussi de démontrer de la responsabilité fiscale. Nous avons une cote de crédit AAA. C'est une bonne chose. C'est cette cote de crédit AAA qui nous permet de faire des grands investissements. Mais on a cette cote de crédit AAA parce qu'on prend des décisions responsables du côté fiscal. Et j'ajouterais que C'était très utile pour nous de parler avec le gouverneur de Banque du Canada. Je sais que les taux d'intérêt élevés sont un grand défi pour beaucoup de familles canadiennes. Alors, le fédéral a une responsabilité de prendre une approche fiscale responsable aussi à cause de cela. On doit travailler dans la même direction que la Banque du Canada, pas dans la direction contraire.
Karina Relman, CBC.
Hi, Karina.
Hello. My questions in English are sort of along the same lines, so you might feel like you're having to repeat yourself a bit. But how receptive were the provinces today and the territories to your message that they need to contribute when it comes to incentives to compete against the US and the Inflation Reduction Act? And what do you say to the ministers, or what did you say to the ministers who might have sort of pushed back saying, well, this is really an Ottawa-Washington conversation as opposed to something that the provinces should be taking on?
Well, first of all, I'm going to leave it to my provincial colleagues to respond on their own behalf. In terms of their reaction, they are more than capable of doing that. What I will say, though, is I'm a little bit puzzled by the second part of your question, because this is not an Ottawa-Washington conversation. This is a conversation between Canadians and companies who are thinking about where to invest. And, you know, international companies, they don't wake up in the morning and think Canada necessarily. We have to create an appealing investment proposition for them. And there are a lot of really appealing things about Canada. We have the most educated people in the world. We have very high labor force participation rates, as I said earlier. We have smart, energetic people, and we have the natural resources that the world needs right now, and we have a very strong industrial and manufacturing base. So there are a lot of great reasons to invest in Canada. Where the Inflation Reduction Act comes in is it has changed the playing field when it comes to the global competition for capital. And it's not anything specific about Canada. It's not anything about Canada negotiating with Washington. This is the law. Congress has passed it. And it's created a new situation for Canada, for all the countries in the world. I'm sure, Karina, that you're very familiar with the very active debates happening in the European Union right now about how the EU can create equally appealing investment conditions given the Inflation Reduction Act. So Canada needs to be in the game as well. And we have done a lot in that space. And as I said in the fall economic statement, we recognize that we need to do more. The federal government has already put in place very powerful tax incentives that apply across the board to attract new capital. And as we said in the fall economic statement, we recognize we're going to have to do more in that space. This is also a time when very specific investment decisions are being made about very specific projects. And I really I cannot emphasize too strongly how much I believe that we need to seize the moment and build the clean economy of the 21st century. I think Canada can and must seize its share of that 21st century industrial economy. And if we're smart, and we are smart, we can have an outsized share. And that will create great jobs for Canadians today and for our children and grandchildren. So we've got to be there, and we will. But when it comes to some of the very specific investment decisions in very specific plans, those will be good for the whole country. They will be particularly good for the provinces where those investments are based. And as has been the practice, in Canada for decades. When those kinds of specific investment plans are being made, when we are specifically out there talking to companies and saying, come invest right here in Canada, we always have a partnership between the federal government and provinces to put our best foot forward and make the strongest possible pitch. And that's something that I think we need to be doing very aggressively today. And yes, it will cost money.
And on the fiscal restraint side of things, when you're talking about healthcare, what was your message to the ministers today about not just the role that the federal government may play in increasing funding, but in their responsibility in terms of fiscally, their responsibility with healthcare, especially for those provinces that actually have a healthier balance sheet right now than Ottawa does?
My message today was the same one that I shared with Cabinet colleagues and with caucus colleagues just a few days ago, last month. And that is that, now is a time when there are two big areas that are calling out for federal investment. One is healthcare. I think it is clear to all Canadians that we need to invest in our healthcare system, and we made commitments during the election campaign to do so, and we will honor those commitments. The other area that is really calling out for investment is building the clean economy of the 21st century. We've started that work. We said in the fall economic statement we would be investing even more in the budget, and we will do so because we must. The alternative is really for Canada to be left out, and I think everyone would agree that is not an alternative. But those things taken together are very significant fiscal pressures. And they come at a time when, as we heard from Governor Macklem, the global economy is slowing down. That global economic slowdown does impose some constraints on the federal budget. And the high interest rate environment, which Governor Macklem also discussed with us, imposes a further constraint, because I certainly am hearing from my constituents of the real pressure that high interest rates are imposing on Canadian families. And it really is my responsibility, the federal government's responsibility, not to do anything that pours fuel on the flames of inflation and forces the Bank of Canada's hand. So when you take those two things together, an environment of high inflation and high interest rates and a slowing economy, that is a constrained fiscal environment. And it means that we do need to behave with real fiscal responsibility, even as we need to make these two big investments. And it was important for me to be candid with provincial and territorial finance ministers about that reality, and also to point out that the federal balance sheet bears overwhelmingly the greatest share of the cost of fighting the COVID pandemic and the COVID recession. The federal government was there for Canadians when they needed us to be there. What we did made a really, really big difference. But it cost a lot of money. 8 out of every $10 spent during the pandemic were spent by the federal government.
Hi, Minister. Laura Stone, Globe and Mail. Back to the healthcare meeting next week. Did you present any specifics of what your government is prepared to offer to the premiers? And can you just give us a sense, how close are you on the numbers? Do you think it's feasible to get to $27 billion increase and a 5% increase thereafter? Can you give us a sense of whether this is at all possible for your government?
I did not present anything specific. We're all going to leave that to the Prime Minister and First Ministers.
Okay, can you just answer though whether you think it's feasible for your government to spend the kind of money that the premiers have long been asking for? It's very public what they have been demanding, and they keep reiterating it. So is this going to happen or not?
Well, as I said, I didn't present anything specific to the provincial and territorial finance ministers, and I do not intend to present anything specific to Canadians right now. I did think it was useful for me to be open and transparent about the fiscal constraints that the federal government does face and the other very big investment pressure in building a clean economy for the 21st century, which is something that I think the provinces and territories have as great an interest as the federal government does in getting done. So it was important to share that. And then, look, the final thing that I will say about healthcare, where I think everyone around the table agreed, because ultimately we represent the same Canadians, is what I think Canadians really care about is having access to a great, publicly funded, universally accessible healthcare system from coast to coast to coast. So that outcome, those results, I think is what we all need to be focused on, because I think that's what matters to Canadians.
Prime Minister, James Munson with Bloomberg Tax. I'm just wondering, could you describe at all just how much more Canada needs to do in terms of attracting that clean tech capital, given the US IRA and given the EU already has this proposal, given the fiscal constraints? How much can Canada actually compete to attract these investments?
Look, I think we have to do whatever it takes, but not more. And that is something that we are working on very, very intensively right now. That's why it was an issue that I did raise with the provincial and territorial finance ministers, because I think it needs to be a team effort. We are aware that Canada has a different system, a different set of incentives currently in place, and of regulations currently in place, and a price on pollution. So what Canada does will be a made in Canada plan. But we also really recognize that there is a global race on right now. The starting gun has been fired to build the clean economy of the 21st century. And, I can't emphasize too strongly how important I think this year is, 2023, when it comes to attracting that capital. And what is really positive, I think, is once you attract the capital, once you get those big investments, these are really long-term projects. Once they're here, they're going to be here for the long term with the jobs, with the technology, with the supply chains that they bring.
And in terms of trying to get the provinces and territories on board, is what happened today that you just mentioned that this is a major priority and you want to hear their ideas over the next few months ahead of the budget? Or did you put forward specific ideas and you're wondering, is this going to be an issue for them? How is the next period looking like in terms of getting intergovernmental cooperation?
Yeah, I would say both of those things. I think, and I don't also want to leave anyone with the impression that this conversation started today. We have been working closely with provinces and territories both on specific investments and on our clean economy strategy overall for years. And in fact, working on investment attraction for the federal government and provincial governments to do that work together is something Canada has done forever. It's how we do things. So I don't want to create the impression that, things started today. But what today did give me a chance to do was to share with my provincial and territorial colleagues the extent to which I believe this is urgent, that we really need to act together now to meet this moment, and to really appeal to them to work with me, to work with my colleague François-Philippe Champagne, to work with my colleague Jonathan Wilkinson, in getting the incentives in place, in making these specific proposals to specific companies, so that, Canada can own the podium of the 21st century clean economy.
Last call here. You're okay. No, this concludes the DPM's press conference. Provinces may be available, and I will turn it over directly to our
Just
provinces.
one more. Have you ever seen any briefing of the Chinese balloon, and what are the comments that you can say? En français.
En français et en anglais.
Et sous-secteur.
OK, très brièvement. OK, je vais essayer, mais c'est une question très importante et je veux être très précise et très claire à cause de ça. So, let me say, as you know, a high-altitude surveillance balloon was detected, and its movements are being actively tracked by NORAD. NORAD, the Canadian Armed Forces, the Department of National Defense, and other partners have been assessing the situation and working in close coordination. Canada's intelligence agencies are working with American partners, and we continue to take all necessary measures to safeguard Canada from foreign intelligence threats. We take this very seriously. Comme vous le savez, un ballon de surveillance à haute altitude a été détecté et ses mouvements font l'objet d'un suivi actif de la part du commandement de la défense aérospatiale de l'Amérique du Nord, NORAD. Le NORAD, les Forces armées canadiennes, le ministère de la Défense nationale et d'autres partenaires évaluent la situation et travaillent en étroite collaboration. Les organismes du renseignement du Canada collaborent avec leurs partenaires américains et continuent de prendre toutes les mesures nécessaires pour protéger l'information d'une nature délicate du Canada contre les menaces du service du renseignement étranger. Nous prendrons cette situation très au sérieux et le Canada est là. Merci.